Greetings to all listeners. This is King Etchu, the radical Pan-African activist from Ambazonia, aka Ambaze. Africans. I want to say this about Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is political. Pan-Africanism is spiritual. Pan-Africanism is economical. And Pan-Africanism is philosophical. Why do I say this? I say this because there's an intense pressure coming from the Western nations, especially the United States and Europe in general, or the European Union. Intense pressure to force African nations to choose sides between what they claim to be democracies and autocracies. In this, when it talks about autocracy, it talks in terms of China and Russia, and I guess they are the democracy. But Africans, what do you think about the democracy of African nations to the democracy of Western nations? The democracy of African nations is completely different from the democracies of Western nations. In a sense, African nations are not true democracies, so called a pseudo-democracy. But they could allow Africa to have those type of pseudo-democracies because it benefits the Western nations. To say, oh yes, Africans are democratic nations, but Africans in reality are not democratic nations. But they want African nations to support the so-called Western democracy to fight against autocracies like China and Russia and other autocracies. But I say that's bullshit. That is not for the interests of Africa. In a way, Africa is being used to shield and protect Western nations so that they could achieve their ultimate goal, which is to be in control in this unilateral system where they're on top and everybody else is on the ground level or below them. So what is Russia and China trying to do? Push for this multipolar world. Meanwhile, they want to continue the unilateral world where Western nations are on top. So it is beneficial for Africans to support the multipolar world instead of having the unipolar world that Western nations are in charge, are in control, and making decisions. Like, for example, they had the World Economic Forum about last week or so, between the 16th to the 20th. The World Economic Forum is in Western unipolar structure where they determine what is supposed to be done for the world and the world is supposed to follow. I'll talk about the World Economic Forum later. But the fact that Western nations have the audacity, the authority, the power, the privilege to force African nations to choose sides over so-called democracies, over autocracies. For example, the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria condemns decisions and encourages South Africa to cooperate militarily with fellow democracies that share mutual commitment to human rights and rule of law. But the so-called U.S. Embassy or United States in general forget history that when black South Africans was fighting for apartheid, it was China and Russia that supported and trained the forces that fought against apartheid in South Africa. So the bond that South Africa has with China and Russia goes deeper than this so-called democracy. Because when black South Africans were fighting against apartheid, the United States was against black South Africans who were fighting apartheid. They were for the institution at the time, which was controlled by white minority. Now, for some reason, they think they have the right, the authority, the privilege, the dignity, or whatsoever to tell South African government to choose their own democracy over relationship that South Africa has had since South Africa fought against apartheid, since black South Africans took over the leadership of South Africa, because South Africa is a black nation, irrespective of the fact that they have a white minority. It's a black nation in the continent of Africa. But South Africa defended its planned naval exercise with Russia and China next month over criticism of non-committal stance or in the war in Ukraine. We are back again at the war in Ukraine. Some of the European leaders say that, the war in Ukraine is a war for the entire world. So other nations have to, support Ukraine over Russia. But the European Union and the rest of the Western nations support Ukraine and even send military gears for Ukraine to use to fight Russia. But Russia doesn't have any other nations that supports them militarily with military gear in this war in Ukraine. Russia is fighting with its weapon and with everything Russia has against Ukraine. And not just against Ukraine, but against the powers that support Ukraine. So this war is no longer a war between two nations, but a war between two powerful forces that are fighting to control global autonomy or global power. It's for Western nations to have the power to do as they see fit, and they are trying to use other nations to support their agenda, because when they successfully take control over all these so-called powers that are fighting them, then there will be no other nation to resist the so-called superpower West. So it's beneficial for Africa to stay non-committal in this war in Ukraine. And it's beneficial for South Africa to stick with their agenda and have their military drill as planned. It is beneficial for Africa to work with Russia and China and not to take the stance of the so-called Western democracy that colonize. They seem to forget that they colonize, and not only colonize us, they are still neo-colonizing the continent of Africa, and yet they want Africa to support them in their war in Ukraine against Russia. Africa must stand independent from Western powers, China, Russia. We must determine our own fate, and we must determine who we want to work with and how we want to work with and how it benefits the continent of Africa. And I believe South Africa is taking the right stand against this so-called pressure coming from Western nations, coming from the European Union, coming from the United States, coming from other Western nations, not to hold the military naval plan that is supposed to happen next week. South Africa has spoken. South Africa has chosen this path, and it is beneficial for South Africa, and it's also beneficial for Africa. That way, it sets a plan or a blueprint for Africa to follow through. Africa must stand against the pressure of Western nations trying to dictate who they can work with and who they cannot work with. Because it was the same Western nations that colonized Africa, and those same Western nations that is still neo-colonizing Africa, because Africa as a continent is not liberated, it's not free. We don't have the power to make decisions based on our economy without the influence of Western nations. We don't have the power to make our spiritual awareness without the influence of the Roman Catholic Church or the Arab Muslims. And we don't have the political willpower to determine our political activities in the continent of Africa without the interference of Western nations. This is something that we as Africans must think of and act on. This is King Etchu. Till next time.